I'm sitting on a narrow shelf of limestone called the Devil's Pulpit, high in the Wye Valley above Tintern Abbey, on the border between England and Wales. And for hundreds of years, it has been the source of a story steeped in local folklore, a story about the devil. It's said that the devil would stand here, on this very rock, and preach to the monks down below in an attempt to lure them away from their faith. Now, whether or not he was successful is a story lost in time. But what grabs me is why has this story lasted so long? Lasted longer than the monks in the abbey, than the people that inhabit this valley. Britain is full of cliffs and shorelines, staggering peaks. So what is special about this small outcrop in the Wye Valley? It says something to me about man's relationship with the paranormal. That what doesn't live are the ghosts and the goblins. It's the places. It's the unchanging nature of place. That from the Cistercian monks of old to the modern tourists, this story of the devil and his sermons lives on in the minds of everyone that comes to visit this place, or just in the little boys that grew up here, like me. My name's James. Welcome to Unquiet Britain. Across Britain stand hundreds of ruined abbeys. Some are older than Tintern, some are larger, some witnessed bloodier histories, yet few have inspired quite so many stories. For generations, people have claimed to hear ghostly chanting drifting through these roofless walls. Others have spoken of a solitary white monk walking silently among the ruins before disappearing altogether. High above the valley stands a narrow ledge of rock called the Devil's Pulpit, where local tradition says the devil himself once preached across the river to tempt the monks below. Whether any of these stories are true is almost beside the point. The more interesting question is this: why this valley? Why has this quiet bend in the River Wye inspired stories of the supernatural for more than 1,000 years? To answer that, we have to begin long before the abbey itself, long before monks, long before castles, long before anyone called this place Tintern. The Wye Valley has always felt like a place apart. Steep limestone cliffs rise abruptly from the river. Ancient woodland clings to the hillsides. Mist gathers without warning, swallowing whole sections of the landscape before revealing them again moments later. Sound behaves strangely here. Voices travel across the water. Ravens seem to call from invisible places among the rocks. Even today, it is a landscape that encourages imagination. 1,000 years ago, it must have felt like the edge of another world. And perhaps that is why the earliest story attached to this valley is not about an abbey at all. It is about a king. His name was Tudrig, part history, part legend. He was known as a king of the kingdom of Gwent, who gave up his crown to live quietly as a hermit. But when his kingdom needed him for one final battle, he came back to fight alongside his son, but sadly received a mortal wound in the doing. As his men carried him home, asked for water, but when they were unable to find any, a spring miraculously broke free of the ground beneath them. Now, whether that miracle actually happened, history cannot tell us. But what it does tell us is something equally revealing, that long before there was an abbey in the Wye Valley, people who lived there believed that the Wye Valley was a place where the connection between heaven and earth was a little bit closer than anywhere else. The landscape was not simply beautiful, it was sacred. That idea appears again and again throughout Britain. Ancient springs, remote valleys, high hills. Long before churches were built upon them, certain landscapes already carried a sense that they were somehow different. Early Christianity rarely erased those places. More often, it embraced them. And when a new religious order arrived here in the 12th century, they found exactly the sort of landscape they had spent years searching for. The Cistercians wanted solitude. Unlike many medieval monasteries, they deliberately avoided towns and centres of power. They believed prayer was best offered in places where the natural world drowned out the noise of ordinary life. The Wye Valley was almost the perfect expression of that ideal. Remote, quiet, hidden among woodland, sheltered by cliffs, fed by a river that connected it to the wider world without ever disturbing its isolation. So in 1131, Walter de Clare granted land beside the Wye to a small community of Cistercian monks. Tintern Abbey was born. At first it was modest, a handful of simple buildings surrounded by forest. But monasteries were engines of medieval life as much as places of worship. The monks cleared woodland, managed farmland, raised sheep, copied manuscripts and welcomed travellers. Their days followed an unchanging rhythm of work and prayer, marked by bells that echoed through the valley from before dawn until long after sunset. Year by year the community prospered. Stone replaced timber. Small buildings became great ones. By the 13th century, the abbey was transformed into one of the finest examples of Gothic architecture anywhere in Britain. Its vast windows flooded the church with coloured light. Slender columns drew the eye upwards. Every detail was designed to lift the mind towards heaven. It must have seemed permanent, as though these walls would stand for eternity. Yet there is something quietly remarkable about Tintern. For all the beauty of the abbey, the valley never stopped being the main character. The monks built with stone taken from the cliffs around them. Their prayers echoed from the same limestone walls that had watched kingdoms rise and fall long before Christianity reached the Wye. They changed the landscape, but they never truly mastered it. The valley simply absorbed them, as it had absorbed everyone before. That perhaps is the first clue to our mystery. People do not tell ghost stories about architecture. They tell them about places. And this place had already been gathering stories for centuries before the first monk laid the first stone. The abbey would become its greatest monument, but it would never become its greatest mystery, because within 300 years the bells would fall silent, the monks would disappear, and the stories would truly begin. You look at this ruin and realise that for hundreds of years it was no such thing. It was alive with activity. Monks in the cloisters, the bells ringing through the valley, the smoke in the workshops, and a place so integral to life in this valley, in Tintern, a place, a hive of spiritual activity that could so quickly, within a generation, turn to ruin. And you wonder how and why. And in a world of such impermanence, do we see how one history ends and the stories just begin? For more than 400 years, the rhythm of the valley scarcely changed. Before dawn, the bells called the monks to prayer. Their voices rose beneath timber roofs, and later beneath soaring vaults of stone, while beyond the abbey, the river Wye continued its slow journey towards the sea. Seasons came and went. Kings were crowned and buried. Wars were fought beyond the valley. Yet here life followed the same ancient pattern, measured not by politics or conquest, but by the steady succession of services that marked each passing day. To those who lived nearby, the abbey must have seemed as permanent as the cliffs themselves. Then, with astonishing speed, it was gone. In 1536, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries reached Tintern. Like hundreds of religious houses across England and Wales, the abbey surrendered to the crown. There was no dramatic siege, no final battle beneath the great west window, no desperate last stand that later generations could turn into legend. The monks signed the deed of surrender, gathered what little remained of their lives, and quietly departed. One day the bells rang. Soon afterwards, they never rang again. It is difficult to imagine what that silence must have meant. For centuries, the valley had been shaped by human voices. Bells echoed from the church tower, prayers drifted through the cloisters, and the routines of monastic life had become as familiar as the sound of the river itself. Then, almost overnight, those sounds disappeared. The lead was stripped from the roof, the stained glass removed from the windows, and rain began falling where choirs had once sung. Frost found its way into carefully cut stone, trees rooted themselves between the walls, and little by little the valley reclaimed the great monument that had stood at its heart. History tells us what happened to the abbey. Folklore concerns itself with what happened afterwards. There is a curious pattern that appears across Britain. Inhabited places rarely gather ghost stories. Every creak on the stairs belongs to an owner. Every seemingly strange noise has a plausible explanation. It's only when these buildings lose their inhabitants that they gain something a little bit extra. A ruined monastery is the perfect home for these kinds of stories. Wind whistling through the stones becomes the sound of ghostly choirs. The moonlight dappling the rocks becomes the figure of a monk walking at night. It says something about the relationship between people and place, that when the people leave, imagination moves in. Tintern became precisely that kind of place. Generations of visitors found themselves struggling to explain why the valley affected them so deeply. They spoke of its beauty, certainly, but beauty alone did not seem sufficient. There was a feeling here that many described but few could define, as though the landscape retained some quiet memory of the lives that had unfolded within it. It was hardly surprising, then, that stories began to gather. Among the oldest is the belief that, under certain conditions, chanting can still be heard drifting through the ruins. Sometimes it is described as plain chant, rising softly before fading into the wind. Sometimes it is no more than the suggestion of distant voices, heard only for a moment before silence returns. There is no convincing evidence that unseen choirs continue beneath an open sky, nor is there any need to invent them. Anyone who has spent time in the Wye Valley knows how strangely sound behaves here. Voices carry across the river with unexpected clarity. Birdsong echoes from the limestone cliffs, and the wind itself seems capable of producing notes that feel almost musical. Yet explanations alone rarely bring folklore to an end. The story survives because generation after generation found it entirely believable that, if such a thing were ever to happen anywhere, it might happen here. The same is true of another figure who has become inseparable from Tintern Abbey, the White Monk. Unlike the restless apparitions of Victorian ghost stories, he is not a figure of terror. He does not threaten, nor does he seek attention. He is usually described as a pale figure glimpsed quietly walking among the ruined cloisters before passing beyond a wall, or dissolving into the changing light. The encounter is over almost as quickly as it begins, leaving behind not fear so much as uncertainty. Did someone really see a solitary monk? Or had the valley, for a fleeting instant, persuaded the eye to believe what the mind was already prepared to imagine? History cannot answer that question, nor perhaps should it try. Ghost stories are rarely important because they prove the supernatural. They matter because they reveal what people felt a place deserved. A battlefield gathers phantom soldiers. An old coaching road acquires a spectral carriage. A ruined monastery remembers its monks. By the 19th century, Tintern had acquired exactly that reputation. Artists came to paint the ruins, antiquarians came to measure them, and visitors travelled considerable distances simply to experience the extraordinary atmosphere of the valley for themselves. Among them were those caught up in the Victorian fascination with spiritualism, when seances, mediums, and automatic writing were discussed with surprising seriousness by otherwise sensible and educated people. It was during this period in 1895 that an account appeared describing automatic writing said to have taken place after a visit to Tintern. The messages supposedly coming from men connected with the Abbey's distant past. Whether those claims arose through unconscious suggestion, wishful thinking, or something altogether stranger is impossible to know. What matters is that the experience happened here. When Victorians wished to imagine the boundary between the living and the dead growing unexpectedly thin, Tintern Abbey seemed an entirely appropriate place for it. By then, the valley had been gathering such stories for centuries. A holy king, a ruined monastery, ghostly chanting, a silent white monk, voices from the distant past. Each story had settled gently upon the last until the folklore became as much a part of Tintern as the stone itself. And yet, remarkable though these tales are, they all seem to lead towards one place. High above the abbey, where the cliffs rise sharply above the river, stands a narrow shelf of limestone from which the whole valley can be seen at once. The people who lived here gave it a name that has endured for centuries. They called it the Devil's Pulpit. Whenever I visit places like this, I try to imagine the sounds rather than the sights. Not just because it's a gloriously hot day and the sun is in my eyes, but because the sights are still here. The walls, the structure of the building, the lead roof, pilfered throughout history, but mostly still here. But it's the sounds that are transient. Throughout the life of this place, there would have been the sounds of conversation, of prayer, of singing. And then all of a sudden, it stopped. And it's that thought that would lead me to believe, yes, of course, people will hear ghosts. They will hear chanting. They will hear the spiritual singing of the undead. Because when the walls remain, you need something to fill the void. It's not the sounds, the creaking doors, the ghostly choirs that are the most unsettling. In a place built for prayer, in a place built for exaltation, the strangest thing of all is the silence. If Tintern Abbey is the heart of this valley's history, then the Devil's Pulpit is surely the heart of its folklore. High above the River Wye, where the limestone escarpment breaks suddenly into open air, a narrow shelf of rock projects out over the trees. From here, the whole valley seems to unfold beneath your feet. The ruined abbey lies below, framed by woodland and the slow curve of the river, while the enclosing cliffs lend the landscape the feeling of a vast natural amphitheatre. It is an extraordinary place to stand. And for centuries it has carried an equally extraordinary name, the Devil's Pulpit. No one can say with certainty when that name first entered the landscape. Like so much genuine folklore, it appears not with a single dramatic beginning, but gradually, becoming so familiar that people eventually forget it ever needed an explanation at all. The explanation that survived is a memorable one. While the monks prayed in the abbey below, the devil himself is said to have stood upon this rock, preaching across the valley in the hope of tempting them away from their faith. It is a wonderfully theatrical image, but it is also a surprisingly thoughtful one. The devil does not storm the abbey gates or appear in fire and thunder. He simply speaks. He offers another voice, another argument, another way of seeing the world. Medieval Christianity understood temptation not as something spectacular, but as something patient, persuasive, and quietly persistent. In that sense, the Devil's Pulpit is less a story about Satan than it is a story about the constant pull of the world beyond the monastery walls. Whether anyone ever believed the devil literally stood here matters rather less than why they chose this place for the story, because landscapes, like stories, are rarely accidental. This hillside has always been a frontier. Close by runs Offa's Dyke, the immense earthwork traditionally associated with King Offa of Mercia, marking for much of its length the shifting boundary between England and Wales. For centuries, this was contested country, where kingdoms met, languages overlapped, and identities blurred into one another. Throughout Britain, such borderlands have proved remarkably fertile ground for folklore. Rivers, mountain passes, coastlines and crossroads all seem to invite stories, perhaps because they exist between one thing and another, and human beings have always found uncertainty easier to explain through narrative than through geography. The Wye Valley is exactly that sort of place. Standing here, it is easy to imagine the abbey as the monks would have known it. Bells would have drifted upwards on still mornings. Smoke from the kitchens would have risen above the rooftops. Tiny figures would have crossed between the church and the cloister, while the great west window caught the changing light. Everything that happened below would have been plainly visible from this rocky ledge, and it takes very little imagination to understand how someone first pictured another figure standing here, watching in silence from the opposite side of the valley. There is another detail that helped the legend endure. Look closely at the exposed limestone, and you will find patches of deep reddish colour running through the rock. Today we know that these are simply mineral deposits, the result of iron staining over immense stretches of time. Earlier generations, however, preferred a more satisfying explanation. These were the devil's footprints, they said, or the marks left by his cloven feet as he stood preaching across the valley. It is exactly the kind of story that appears throughout Britain. A strangely balanced boulder becomes the work of giants. An unusual cave becomes the entrance to the other world. A standing stone becomes a witch, or a king, or a circle of dancers frozen for breaking the Sabbath. When people encountered landscapes that seemed unusual, they responded with imagination, not because they lacked reason, but because stories have always been one of humanity's oldest ways of making sense of a place. The Devil's Pulpit belongs to that long tradition. Yet there is something else about this place that refuses to be dismissed quite so easily. Stand here for any length of time, and the perspective begins to shift. Down in the valley, Tintern Abbey feels immense, its soaring windows and elegant Gothic arches dominating everything around them. From up here, however, the proportions are entirely different. The monastery becomes only one small feature within a landscape of far greater age and scale. The cliffs rise above it. The woodland stretches beyond it. The river continues its journey with complete indifference to the ambitions of the people who built here. Magnificent though the abbey became, it was always the newcomer. The River Wye had carved this valley over millions of years. The limestone cliffs had witnessed forgotten kingdoms long before the first Norman crossed the border, and the woodland had already gathered centuries of memory before the first monk ever set foot upon these banks. Perhaps that is why the folklore of Tintern feels so deeply rooted in the landscape itself. The stories do not seem to have been attached to the valley afterwards. They feel as though they have grown out of it, as naturally as the ivy that now climbs the abbey walls, or the moss that softens its ancient stone. Some visitors have found poetry here, others have found faith, others inevitably have found ghosts and devils. They are perhaps all trying to describe the same sensation, that certain landscapes possess a character which resists easy explanation. The Devil's Pulpit asks us to imagine a struggle between good and evil played out across the valley. The ruined abbey below invites rather different questions. What becomes of a sacred place when the prayers have ended? Can centuries of ritual leave any trace behind? And why do so many people, even now, leave Tintern convinced that the story of this valley did not end with the monks? Those are questions the Devil's Pulpit cannot answer. For that we must return to the ruins themselves, where the oldest ghost stories of Tintern Abbey continue to linger among the empty arches, waiting, as they have for generations, for someone else to tell them. There comes a point in the evening when Tintern Abbey changes. It is difficult to say exactly when it happens. The last visitors drift back towards the car park. Conversations fade into the distance, and the great west window, which only moments before had stood bright against the afternoon sky, begins to fill instead with shadow. The valley grows quieter, though never entirely silent. A raven calls somewhere high above the cliffs. The river continues on its way, unseen but never quite unheard. Even the wind seems to lower its voice. It is at moments like these that the abbey feels least like a historic monument, and most like a place where history still lingers. That perhaps is why Tintern has inspired so many stories. Not because anyone can prove that ghostly monks walk these ruins after dark, or that chanting really drifts through the empty arches, but because the landscape has an extraordinary gift for making such things feel possible. The ruins invite imagination in a way that complete buildings rarely can. Stand beneath these vast Gothic windows, and it takes remarkably little effort to picture them filled once again with coloured glass. The open sky disappears beneath an imagined roof. Empty cloisters fill with the quiet movement of men who have been gone for almost 500 years. For a fleeting moment it seems to return. Perhaps every ruined monastery possesses that quality, although Tintern seems to possess it more than many others. It may be the setting, the cliffs, the river, the fact that over so many generations people have come and gone, time has moved on, but the abbey remains. Or perhaps it is simply that this landscape has been accumulating stories for so long that they have become inseparable from the stones themselves. Whatever the reason, visitors have continued to leave with the same curious impression, not necessarily frightened, not even convinced that they have witnessed anything unusual, simply aware that this valley seems reluctant to let go of its past. That is a very different thing from being haunted. Perhaps it is something rather older. For centuries, people have returned here looking for different things. Medieval pilgrims sought God. Romantic poets found beauty. Victorian spiritualists searched for evidence that the dead might still speak. Today, we arrive with cameras, guidebooks, and smartphones. Yet many of us leave asking exactly the same question our predecessors asked. Why does this place feel so different? There is no single answer. The historian can explain when the abbey was founded, who built it, and why it fell into ruin. The geologist can explain the cliffs, the caves, and the iron staining on the rocks above the valley. The psychologist can tell us how expectation shapes perception, and why the human mind is so quick to find meaning in shadows, in echoes, and silence. None of these explanations is wrong, yet none of them seems quite sufficient on its own. Because folklore is not really concerned with certainty, it concerns itself with memory, with the stories that survive because generations of ordinary people felt they were worth passing on. A dying king asked for water, the devil preaching across the valley, ghostly chanting after the bells have fallen silent, a white monk who still walks where his brothers once prayed. Taken individually, they prove nothing. Taken together, they tell us something far more interesting. For more than 1,000 years, people have looked upon this valley and felt that it possessed a character unlike anywhere else. That feeling has outlived kingdoms, it has outlived monasteries, it has even outlived the beliefs that first gave many of these stories their meaning. The abbey becomes a ruin. The folklore never did. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Tintern. Not simply that extraordinary things were once believed to have happened here, but that after all this time, the valley still has the quiet ability to persuade ordinary people to pause, to wonder, and to leave carrying one more story of their own. Now, we've talked about devils, ghosts, God, abbeys, the list goes on. And there's something I take away from my day at the Devil's Pulpit in Tintern, is that the stories that have been passed down feel like inheritances, that with every generation it's passed down to the next. And how the legacy of the Wye Valley outlives the people that inhabit it. And it's that point that makes me think that, supernatural or not, that the paranormal here isn't the main character. The landscape is, the valley is, the rocks, the trees, the birds that interrupt you. That's worth coming to see on its own. Now, whether you leave believing in ghosts, believing in spirits in the abbey, believing in the devil on his pulpit, or you just come away feeling that you've experienced one of the most beautiful places in Britain, that's fine. Because the landscape doesn't change, but our experience of it does. This is Unquiet Britain. See you next time.